Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I welcome the opportunity to speak to the government motion before us. The intent of this motion is fundamentally about securing government compliance with a vote passed by Parliament. Often we hear the phrase, "the House is the master of its own destiny," used, but more often or not, either as a somewhat hollow or rhetorical expression or as a defiant wishful exhortation. But recently it's rung with clarity and people have taken it a little more seriously than rhetorically, now that it's been shown to have some teeth. Specifically, this has occurred within the context of the other place, and while I'm conscious of not reflecting on that chamber, I do note and applaud its finding of its teeth, a bit like a slumbering giant slowly awakening to its own superpower. It's fair to acknowledge this, Mr President, without tipping over into inappropriate reflection, as the only reason we are here now having this particular debate is because the other place had exercised its right to be master of its own destiny by voting for certain documents to be tabled. And if that had eventuated at the time, and then that tabling would have made those tabled documents public to all MPs and indeed all members of the public interested in the document's contents. And that, for me, Mr President, is a sticking point and the flaw of this motion, despite its origins and intent to deliver on an earlier parliamentary vote. This motion now details a shift from making public to the public via tabling in Parliament to making available to a privileged few. And, Mr President, I don't use the word privilege in this context as pejorative, but rather as a reflection on the fact that we, as some of those potential few who are included due to our current parliamentary privilege, holding status. I'm aware that this privileged access concerns other members across the chamber as well, both chambers, and that there's a sense of being potentially compromised as public debate on the AFL stadium continues. In fact, I note that the Greens MPs have declared they will not participate in this process as established via this motion, although they did not begrudge the fellow members from having the choice. While acknowledging that the view but do not divulge mechanism provided for by this motion is proffered as a compromise way forward, it's important to stress that it should not prevent any member who views the documents from subsequently still publicly arguing that they do not believe those documents should remain secret from the Tasmanian community. Mr President, we must still reserve the right to keep calling for full transparency to the Tasmanian community, which can be done without divulging the content of those documents. And that's a key requirement for me, Mr President, that it's clear that those who view the documents still have the right to criticise the withholding of those documents from the Tasmanian community if that remains their position. And secondly, I have a query surrounding the timeframes by which viewing members are required to remain silent on that which they have viewed, which I hope the Leader can clarify for me. Should members take this opportunity and view these documents to inform themselves, when are the strings detached? Are those members required to keep mum on the document's contents for a specific period of time, or until votes on the proposed project of state significance amendment and AFL stadium proposal have been taken, until there's a firm decision on the fate of the proposal, until the first game perhaps of an eventuating Tasmanian AFL team should it come to pass, or until perhaps 20 years have lapsed, whether they're still a member of Parliament or not? Also, who decides and by what mechanism when the cone of silence is lifted in relation to this motion?
Through you, Mr President, the limit is forever. There is commercial in confidence information in that, and it's and I know that you always say things like that, but it can never be released. So whatever information that you read or understand, you cannot talk about.
Thank you. And lastly, Mr President, will records be kept of which MPs have viewed the documents and for how long? How long will those records be kept? While the motion details the clerks will have the authority to access, manage and provide access to the papers to members, it doesn't specify any record taking or keeping of those viewees. And this may also be pertinent in a potential scenario should a member who did not view those documents via this mechanism but received access to the content contained in those documents via other means, for example, through a leak or some other such means. I would be very interested to have those matters clarified by the government. We'd certainly want to be able to clarify that somebody hadn't seen the documents through this mechanism but may have then had access to them through other means and spoken of them as a result of that. Or this House, actually, Mr President, as master of its own destiny, may decide to take it upon itself to provide clarity if needed. Mr President, I want to take the opportunity to touch on how and why we find ourselves debating this motion today. It had been Interesting to note, Mr President, the commentary over the last few weeks of the apparent fragility of minority government being on show. And while that may be one way of thinking of the current parliamentary makeup, the other approach would be to consider it as the robustness of parliamentary oversight of the executive that's been on show. The public record shows this halfway house of semi-released documents was not volunteered by the government, but it was rather a compromise forged under duress. But it is a compromise. It does not seek to honour the intent of the earlier parliamentary vote, which was public release, and it does not provide members. It does provide members, though, with an important choice, and I acknowledge that, and it is a step forward. However, it must be said that it's a matter of record that this government has been warned repeatedly about compulsive secrecy, which then degenerates into desperate dissembling when its equivocating attempts are rejected and pressure is applied. A tendency which has been particularly on display surrounding public debate on the proposed AFL stadium since it suddenly became the deciding factor on whether we in fact achieved a Tasmanian AFL team. It's no exaggeration, Mr President, to recognise that the default position of secrecy at all costs is a cancer in any system of governance. And one compromise motion, such as this, does not a remission make. Mr President, Queensland's 2022 Coldrake Review final report states that a cultural shift in government which encourages openness from the top starts with cabinet processes. For those unfamiliar with the Coldrake Review, it was commissioned by the Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk and was undertaken by Emeritus Professor Peter Coldrake, AO, former Vice-Chancellor of Queensland University of Technology, QUT. The review was established due to recognised, and I quote, widespread disaffection with the performance of governments and rising expectation that our politicians and their officials be more accountable and transparent in their dealings and behave with integrity. This review was prompted by a number of issues, some publicly ventilated, which together paint the picture of an integrity system under stress, trying to keep check on a culture that from the top down is not meeting public expectations. The title of this review, Mr President, is fittingly, Let the Sun Shine In. Mr President, I've mentioned the Coldrake Review here in this place before and its Let the Sun Shine In report when other accountability and integrity matters were debated, and there are many points made in the report from which Tasmania could learn. However, in relation to the matter before us now, the pertinent point is what this report had to say about changing the culture from cabinet downwards. As the report says, and I quote, the community certainly tires very quickly when politicians of any colour and in any jurisdiction hide behind cabinet or commercial incompetence to fend off legitimate questioning on even routine matters. The Coldrake report, final report, second recommendation reads this, and I quote, cabinet submissions and their attachments, agendas and decisions papers be proactively released and published online within 30 business days of such decisions. Yes, people did hear that correctly, Mr President, not 30 years but 30 days, as a matter of routine. Not requiring Parliament to take up its work time with the distraction of rushed and cobbled together ad hoc motions, such as this, on a controversial case by controversial case basis. And significantly, Mr President, to a limited degree, the Queensland Government adopted this recommendation with a general rule. Only the final decisions of Cabinet are released on the Government website. On the cabinet.qld.gov.au website, people can search the Cabinet document database by topic or date. It's a useful and accessible mechanism. Another contemporary example, Mr President, is that set by our cousins across the Tasman in New Zealand. This jurisdiction has consistently broken new ground in implementing open government principles. For example, the New Zealand Cabinet papers and minutes must be proactively released within 30 business days of final decisions being taken by Cabinet, unless there is good reason not to publish all or part of the material or to delay the release. This policy applies to all papers lodged from the 1st of January 2019. The New Zealand Government publishes a proactive release of Cabinet material policy, which details how it's to be applied to Cabinet and Cabinet Committee papers and associated minutes, and any attachments or appendices to the papers that are lodged from the 1st of January 2019. Interestingly, Mr President, it also requires that all Cabinet and Cabinet Committee papers must include a proactive release section, which states whether or not the Minister proposes to release the material within 30 days of decisions being made by Cabinet. And if a Cabinet paper is not intended to be proactively released, then the reason why must be explained on the record. This is an important principle to note, Mr President, and it's consistent with how our Right to Information Act should also operate. The existence of relevant documents should be acknowledged, accompanied by a description and justification as to why they will be wholly or partially exempt from release. Tellingly, the New Zealand government's proactive release policy states, and I quote, "Democracies thrive when citizens trust and participate in their government. Proactive release of information promotes good government and transparency and fosters public trust and confidence in agencies." A point made by the Coldrake Review, Mr President, as well as by those closer to home. So members will be aware of the 2021 Legislative Council Select Committee report on the production of documents. I was a member of the committee inquiry along with the Honourable Member for Murchison, Honourable Member for Elwick, Honourable Member for Prosser and the former Honourable Member for Launceston, Mr Ivan Dean. And while not focusing solely on the issue of release of cabinet documents, it did provide considerable amount of relevant material and lessons to be learned. The somewhat tortuous path that has led us to this particular point on this particular motion that we are debating today sadly indicates a defiant refusal so far to learn those lessons, particularly those lessons which focused on political culture and the release of cabinet and other sensitive documents within the Westminster system. It would also appear that the fundamental lessons that the government and the executive is subordinate to Parliament may only be recently sinking in for some. That committee had the benefit of many local and interstate expert witnesses' testimony, and while time considerations mean I'll refrain from spending time detailing the report's findings now, I do urge members who have yet to have a chance to do so to read and consider the committee's report and its accompanying expert witness transcripts, particularly around the issue of publication of cabinet documents. Suffice to say, if the lessons contained in that report had been heeded, the government and this Parliament may have avoided finding itself in this current situation. And I do note now also that just today we've seen a motion which will be debated in the future in this place from the member for Murchison, which is going to hopefully proactively have our Standing Orders Committee review that production of documents report and
to wait to a time when there was a much more favourable environment for such an approach.
I think the environment may be quite fertile for such a debate now, member for Murchison. So that's I welcome that motion tabled here today and look forward to the debate on it and to hopefully also it being actioned. To conclude, Mr President, earlier I made reference to the Queensland 2022 Coldrake Review into public accountability and its report, Let the Sun Shine In. Let the sun shine in, Mr President, and that was meant to be the result of this motion that we have today, and it was the core goal of those behind the debate which resulted in this motion within the context of the publicly controversial AFL stadium proposal and its associated decision-making processes. However, in this case, that sunshine is not for all, and for those who briefly get to experience those rays, they then need to put on their sunglasses and, away from the community's perspective, pretend they didn't see what they saw. In the context of a lively, current and increasingly polemical public debate on the issue at the heart of this matter, this has the sense of a Greek tragedy, where the fates give with one hand while dealing a lethally sharp double-edged sword with the other. You can look as part of your job as an elected representative, but then you must not share with those who put you in that job on their behalf. As some others have reflected, this motion establishes a process which risks making those who choose to view the documents feel somehow complicit or at least compromised when still attempting to be involved in the public debate on the stadium issue. And given we know all members in this place will be called on to vote on a bill amending the project estate significance process and then the project's actual order at least once, these concerns of being, or the perception of being, compromised in the eyes of our constituents is a real one. But ultimately, Mr President, this motion does move us forward a little as it provides members with choice, which is something I support. Further, the processes which deliver that choice, as detailed in the mechanics of the motion, are transparent. While the content of any documents viewed via the process may not be transparent, at least it's transparent as to how and why that is the case. And crucially, maybe in the long term, we also see a chink of light fracturing the almost archaic and medieval mystique surrounding the Cabinet in Confidence Convention, and that Tasmania appears to cling to. These human-made conventions can be and must be adapted and allowed to evolve in the public interest to meet modern expectations of good governance and a robust democracy. The Westminster ceiling will not fall in, Mr President. And Mr President, although I will be voting in support of this motion, as mentioned, I should take the choice, and should I take the choice to view the documents as provided for by the mechanism outlined in the motion, I reserve the right to publicly advocate for their full public release, should I consider that to be appropriate and in this case. Further, I also have some queries, as I mentioned earlier, surrounding the length of time, which the Leader has provided some comments on and may have more comments to provide. I also had the question around record keeping, around viewing the documents, so that it could be clear if there was to be disclosure for later on, who had been a viewer and who hadn't been a viewer of those documents. So I look forward to listening to further contributions of any fellow members and to some further answers to those questions.
Honourable members, before I